Hi, I'm Nick Thomas and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing and another video on sword terminology. Now, broadsword is one of those old terms that goes back to Middle English, over 1,000 years. So it's an old term, and on the one hand, really not a very useful one, and on the other hand, quite a useful one as long as you know how and why it's being used. So when you ask the average person what a broadsword is, they're probably going to answer with something like one of these two, which today we would usually just call this one a sword or an arming sword and this one a long sword, although historically that could vary quite a bit, and we'll cover that terminology and other terminology for these swords in other videos. But in terms of calling these broadswords, that's actually not very helpful at all, because they usually wouldn't have been called this historically, and it's not very helpful today. So if you look at most dictionary definitions of what a broadsword is, it usually says something like a broad, heavy blade for cutting, or only for cutting. And that definition is sort of accurate and at the same time not accurate at all. So we're going to look at broadsword and how it was used specifically in a martial arts and sort of sword terminology based context, because that's where it's really important, and try and understand how it's being used and why, because it is actually a useful term when we use it appropriately. So, why the term broadsword became popular? Well, it became popular in the late 17th century to differentiate itself from what was becoming commonplace at the time, which was small sword practice. So before the small sword, you had rapier, which is usually a form of cut and thrust sword. But when you get to the small sword, it is only thrust. It's a narrow, short, light blade for thrusting only. And then you see the term broadsword becoming useful to differentiate between this light thrust-only blade and a heavier, either entirely cut or cut and thrust blade. And there's also something in the middle there, which is the shearing sword or spadroon, and we're going to cover that in other videos. But for now, we can just look at that comparison of small sword and broadsword to understand what they are and why. So when the small sword was becoming popular in the late 17th century, they were narrow blades like this, which are very agile, very fast, and usually had no edges. In fact, this one does. It is actually a double-edged blade with a lenticular cross-section, and again we'll talk about more about this sword in the small sword video. But they realistically were a thrust-only blade, and they were sometimes called a walking sword, a court sword, things like this, and they're predominantly a civilian sword for thrust-only purposes. And then to use the broadsword term beside it then makes a whole lot of sense, because the broadsword term is being used for that other sword across the spectrum, which is the heavy blade that's for cutting, and it might be entirely cutting or it might be cut and thrust, because the broadsword was not only a cutting sword. It can be, but in actual fact it can often be a mixed cut and thrust sword as well. It's just a reasonably heavy cut and thrust sword. So let's go on to what the term was usually used for. In the late 17th century, and you can look at, say, manuals from Sir William Hope, he really starts talking about the broadsword and the small sword and stuff like that. And what he's talking about usually with the broadsword is something like this. And this is what you recognise as the Scottish basket hilt, sometimes also called claymore. And we'll have to talk about that term because that's a very confusing one that gets people all twisted up. And it also was very commonly used throughout the British Isles and elsewhere, but this form was very typical of British Isles generally. And the only reason it became more common for association with the Scots is because the full basket hilts faded away from usage in the rest of the British Isles, whereas the Scots held on to them rather longer. And so this is associated with the Scots, and specifically the Highlanders, whereas it was more universally a general sort of British basket hilted sword. And this one is just ornated in a very Scottish way, but functionally it's typical British broadsword or basket hilt. So as we can see with this is a training sword, but this is a broad blade with two edges. So basic dictionary definition of a broadsword, this is what it is, although most people would have thought of a simple hilt. Now actually it's kind of accurate to compare to that one-handed sword I showed at the start of the video, because this is the equivalent. This is the 18th century equivalent of that arming sword, or cruciform hilt medieval sword that I showed earlier. It's just the basket hilts took a little time to develop for all sorts of reasons that we'll have to go into in another video. But realistically, basket hilts developed in the mid 16th century, and they just started fitting them to those one-handed arming swords. And if you see early basket hilts, they still have the quillons, the cruciform-shaped bars that stick out from here, because they just took a cruciform medieval arming sword design and just started adding additional protective sections. And eventually, when they'd added enough, there was no reason to have the straight quillon anymore and just took it off. So actually, the 18th century broadsword, and these kind of swords were realistically in the 17th and even in the late 16th, but this style is an 18th century broadsword. They are very much the later equivalent of the old medieval sword or arming sword. So you could therefore say, well, therefore the broadsword terminology works for that sword down there. Yes, it kind of does, but it wasn't being used in the period of those swords, whereas in the period of this sword, broadsword was absolutely a common term that you'd come across in a fencing academy, within the military, within newspapers. It became incredibly common, and broadsword referred to a sword that had a broad blade of a good length, because that's another significant point to the broadsword. If it is fairly short, under, let's say, 30 inches of blade length, we'd normally call it something else. It would normally then become a cutlass or a hanger, couteau, something of that sort. So to be a broadsword, the blade needs to be fairly hefty so that it can deliver a good cut. It doesn't have to be able to thrust, although it usually will be able to. And it has to be of a certain length, so let's say over a 30-inch blade, approximately, because that's not set in stone. So a reasonable length and able to deliver a good cut. And yeah, in terms of terminology, you'll see that the term broadsword wasn't used an awful lot until the time of, late 17th century. Before then, you'll see more commonly terms like short sword and long sword being used. And if you go back to, say, the period of George Silver in the late 16th and early 17th century, he uses terms short sword and long sword, and his long sword is a one-hander. So he'd look at a sword like this and call it either a short or a long sword, depending on the length of the blade. Whereas, we get to the late 17th century and suddenly this is now pretty universally in Britain being called a broadsword. Now actually, a broadsword doesn't have to have a basket hilt, far from it. If you look at William Hope, he gives some clear definitions as to how different terms are used, and he breaks them down to what kind of blade they have. So the hilt is not hugely important. Some particular blade types might commonly have a particular type of hilt, but not always. And he divides all these different swords by purely the blade type. So he describes the broadsword as a broads blade, mostly for cutting, and doesn't talk about the hilt. And then the small sword is for thrust only, and then has the in-between, the light cut and thrusts, which we'll talk about in other videos. And therefore, you can legitimately have a sword like this. So this is not a basket hilt. This is actually a slot hilt with a couple of extra bars on the outside. And this hilt actually kind of resembles almost the 3 bars that you see in the 19th century. But this is a dragoon's sword. So a dragoon, a form of cavalry. This is a dragoon's sword from about 1770, British again. And so a lot of people, this would look like a spadroon. In fact, the overall construction, the style, the shape, the guard is fine. You could call this a spadroon, except for the fact that it has a very long blade and is overall quite heavy. So this one is just under 1 kilo, so it's quite a weight, and it's got a long blade and a fair bit of mass in the blade. So this you would actually call a broadsword, and they did call them broadswords. So this is a cavalry broadsword, but you may also just call it a dragoon sword. And what is notable with this one is it's single-edged, so you've got a completely blunt, thick back edge. Now, these kind of swords we normally call a backsword, and that will come up in another video. But the reason it's important to this video is the term backsword in the mid-18th century was phasing out, and therefore you can find Scottish swords of the 18th century that have double-edged blades like this and single-edged blades like this. In fact, the ones that were made in large quantities for Scottish troops were usually made with single-edged blades, what you might call a backsword. But defining a sword by how many edges it's got is actually not very useful, because a lot of backswords are actually sharpened on the last few inches of the back anyway, and therefore functionally they're exactly the same as the double-edged blade. What's more important is how much weight they have and where the mass is distributed. So the term backsword was really phasing out in that mid-18th century period, and broadsword was then applied to any broad long blade, no matter how many edges it has, and that makes a whole lot more sense. So if you see a sword like this with a single or double-edged, it's legitimate to call it a broadsword, even though some people will get angry and insist that it's actually a backsword. So yeah, backsword was phasing out of usage. And to be honest, I'm glad that it did, because as I said, it's functionally not a very useful term, because what you really want to know with a backsword is it light or is it heavy? And what happened is that there was a split there. The light backswords became known as spadroons, and the heavy backswords became known as broadswords. And likewise, from the double-edged perspective, the heavy double-edged were broadswords and the light double-edged spadroons. So that makes a whole lot more sense. You're talking more about how a sword is functionally and not the edges that it has, which make no difference to the actual fight. So there you go, broadsword. Broadsword is a straight, sort of medium length blade that has a fair bit of mass, can deliver a powerful cut, but maybe still a cut and thrust sword, but a heavier cut and thrust sword. When the dictionary defines it as a heavy blade, you might assume that means it is slow. That is not the case at all. Some broadswords can be very heavy. So this kind of broadsword can weigh anything from about 1 kilo up to about 1.8 kilos and sometimes even more. So you can find agile ones and you can find really heavy beasts. But because they have this really significant basket hilt, that usually counterbalances that mass. So the total weight may be very high, but they often handle more, basically with more agility than you might think, because all of this mass brings the point of balance down, and therefore you're not having to move around all this mass. Well, you are moving the mass, but it's counterbalanced. Whereas if you had a one-handed sword of 1.5 kilos that didn't have a lot of counterbalance, it's going to feel like a crowbar, or far worse than that. So yeah, you can have single and double-edged broadswords, particularly when the terminology starts to change in the late 18th century. And then we need to go on and just mention that the broadsword term did start getting used even more broadly again. So, for example, the famous 1796 light cavalry sabre did sometimes get called a broadsword. So, for example, within the horse artillery, which the horse artillery were equipped with the light cavalry sabres, and in some sources they described them as a broadsword. And likewise in some militia sources that used large sword bayonets, which is basically a form of backsword that is going to be used as a bayonet in this case, they called their sword a broadsword as well. And it sort of makes sense, because as long as it's long enough and has enough mass, it would make sense to call it a broadsword. Because ultimately this sabre, well, what is it? It's a broad blade, mostly designed for cutting. So it makes some sense to call it a broadsword. However, I'd recommend not calling this a broadsword, even though historically there's some examples of that. I'd recommend you stick to sabre for this one. So yeah, broadsword did get used a little bit more broadly as time went on, which isn't always very helpful. So, in conclusion, what should we apply the term broadsword to? Well, as a rule, 17th to 19th century blades that are of good length, broad, and with a fair bit of mass in the tip. And they can be applied to single or double-edged swords. This is an English backsword from the early 17th century, so it's legitimately called a backsword. And yet, if you took this sword into the 18th century, you would legitimately call it a broadsword. And there you have it. So a useful term, because it's defined in the blade. Don't always look at the hilt, because a broadsword doesn't have to have a full basket hilt. It can have a variety of different hilts, as a lot of swords can. But look at the blade. Is it of a good length with a fair bit of mass and can cut and thrust? It's probably going to be called a broadsword. And avoid using the term I would for any curved blades, because the curvature does functionally change things. We do, for example, use the curvature for certain thrust attacks, so it is important to the way the sword is used. So I do hope you enjoyed the video. That is the broadsword for you. So in the 17th to 19th century, a single or double-edged blade of a good length, let's say over 30-inch blade, that can deliver a powerful cut but can likely still thrust. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll be bringing plenty more for you. Thanks for watching.